She never raised her voice, not once. Not in the coffee shop when the man behind her kept bumping her chair. Not in the parking lot when two guys followed her for half a block laughing like it was a joke. Not when her co-workers talked over her in meetings, or when strangers on the subway leaned too close, or when the world kept mistaking her silence for softness. She just watched, quietly, with those still, flat eyes that never really blinked the way normal people blink. Nobody at the library knew her name for the first 3 months she worked there. They called her the quiet one, the one who alphabetized the returns before anyone asked. The one who always sat with her back to the wall, the one who drank her coffee black and never ever talked about her past. Her name was Sarah Cole, 29 years old, 5'6", 138 pounds of absolute nothing. At least, that's what they saw. A quiet girl with a soft cardigan and sensible shoes and a small gold stud in her left ear. A girl who smiled politely and said, "Have a good evening," and went home alone. What they didn't see was the other thing. The thing underneath the cardigan and the quiet and the sensible shoes. The thing that the Navy spent 4 years building inside her bones. People make assumptions about quiet women. They always have. They see the stillness and decide it means fear. They see the soft voice and decide it means weakness. They see a woman alone at a table and decide it means available. 3 men made that decision on a Tuesday night in October. They picked the wrong Tuesday. They picked the wrong table. They picked the wrong quiet girl. And by the time they understood what they'd actually walked into, by the time the noise stopped and the dust settled and someone's phone was already dialing 911, Sarah Cole had already straightened her cardigan, picked up her coffee cup, and gone back to being perfectly, terrifyingly quiet. This is her story, not the part that made the news. Not the 30-second clip that spread across the internet with a caption that read, "Woman defends herself in diner. Watch what happens next." The real story. The whole one. The one that starts long before that Tuesday night and cuts much deeper than anything a phone camera caught. The one about what it costs to become the kind of person who never needs to raise her voice. Sarah Cole grew up in a house where the loudest thing was silence. Not peaceful silence, not the good kind, the kind that sits in a room after everyone has said what they needed to say and the air just settles. The other kind. The kind with pressure behind it. The kind that has a shape, a body, almost, that takes up space at the dinner table and follows you down the hallway to your room and sits outside the bathroom door while you brush your teeth. Her father was a man of very few words and even fewer expressions. Gerald Cole, former Army, spent 8 years in service, came back different, the way men sometimes come back different, and never quite found the version of himself that had existed before he left. He was not a cruel man, that matters. He was not a drunk, not violent, not absent in the ways people usually list when they explain difficult childhoods. He was just compressed, like something had been squeezed out of him over there and never squeezed back in. He worked at the hardware store. He kept the yard clean. He said grace before dinner and meant it. He just never laughed, never really talked, never touched his kids the way their friends' fathers touched theirs, easy and careless. A hand on the shoulder, a ruffle of hair. Sarah's mother, Linda Cole, compensated with noise. She talked enough for both of them. Filled every room she entered with the sound of herself, not meanly, not out of anxiety, just from some deep natural reflex that hated a vacuum. She was a good woman who laughed at her own jokes and made biscuits from scratch on Sunday mornings and cried at every movie, even the ones that weren't sad. She loved her family loudly and well. But even Linda's noise had a ceiling. There were things the Coles didn't talk about. There were nights when Gerald would go to the garage and not come back until after the house was dark and quiet. And Linda would sit at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. And nobody said anything, and eventually Sarah and her brother Marcus would drift to their rooms and close their doors softly because somehow they both understood, without anyone ever explaining it, that softness was required, that taking up space required permission they hadn't been given. Marcus rebelled eventually. Loudly. In all the ways teenagers rebel, music at unreasonable volumes, a brief and dramatic interest in skateboarding, a semester of grades that made their mother cry for real. He got it out of his system by 16, settled back into himself, became the easy one. Sarah went the other way. She got quieter, not as performance, not as protest, just as the most natural response she had to a world that seemed to operate in frequencies she hadn't been calibrated to. At school, she was the girl teachers described as focused and self-contained and mature for her age, which were polite ways of saying she made them slightly uneasy without being able to say why. She had friends, 2 or 3, real ones, the kind that last, but even with them she was the listener, the one who sat with her chin in her hand and paid full attention while other people talked, who remembered everything they said and never made them feel rushed or judged. They loved her for it. They also, if they were being honest, found her a little unknowable. She was 17 when she first saw the recruiter. He came to her school for a career day, Navy, dress whites. He stood at a table covered in brochures next to a girl from the Army and a man from the Air Force and a woman from the Marines, and most of the students at Jefferson High circled the table the way they circled anything that smelled institutional. Cautiously, from a distance, planning their escape, Sarah stopped, read every brochure, asked 12 questions, shook the man's hand, and walked away without taking anything. She came back at the end of the day when the gym was almost empty and the recruiters were packing their tables. She asked 3 more questions. Then she left again. She enlisted 8 months after graduation, her mother cried. Her father shook her hand, and then, in a moment Sarah has never talked about to anyone, that she carries like a stone in the center of her chest, pulled her into a hug. Hard and brief and wordless. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. It was the first time he had hugged her since she was 9 years old. She thought about those 4 seconds a lot during the first weeks of boot camp, when she was running in the dark at 5 in the morning with salt in her throat and her legs screaming, and an instructor 3 inches from her ear, delivering a detailed and creative assessment of her character. She held those 4 seconds like a match in a windstorm. Boot camp didn't break her. This surprised people, and it surprised them in a particular way. They had expected her quietness to be a liability, had expected her to fall apart somewhere around week 3, when the sleep deprivation and the physical punishment and the constant noise of other people's fear became too much. Instead, something happened that Sarah didn't quite have language for at the time. The noise of boot camp, the shouting, the controlled chaos, the relentless external pressure actually quieted the thing inside her that had always been so carefully, exhaustingly managed. She had spent her whole life performing calm. Here, the performance was unnecessary. The external matched the internal, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to pretend to be anything at all. She was simply excellent, not the best in her class at everything. She was not the fastest runner, or the strongest, or the most technically precise in the early weeks of weapons training, but she had a particular quality that her instructors noticed and then started quietly tracking. She was the most consistent. When everyone else's performance degraded under pressure, under sleep deprivation, under the compounding stress of week 4 and week 6 and week 8, Sarah Cole's numbers stayed flat. She got tired. She felt fear. She would tell you that directly and without drama if you asked. But she had an absolute refusal to let those things translate into anything visible, into anything that could be used against her. This refusal was not new. She had just never had a context for it before. After basic, she went to A school in Pensacola. Then she was selected for something else entirely. The process that followed, the selection, the screening, the months of evaluation that felt less like testing and more like being taken apart and catalogued, is not a thing she discusses, not out of secrecy. Just because it belongs to a version of her that she keeps separate, the way you keep a tool in a case, clean and maintained and not for casual handling. What came out the other side of that process was a woman who could disassemble and reassemble an M4 in the dark, who could navigate 3 miles of open ocean without instruments, who had learned specifically and systematically how to control every physical response her body produced under stress, heart rate, breathing, the shaking in the hands, until her exterior was as useful and unrevealing as a closed door. She also learned how to put people on the floor, efficiently, without anger, without wasted movement, like closing a drawer. Saw 2 deployments, came home from the second one and sat in her car in the parking lot of the airport for 45 minutes before she was ready to go inside. She never talked about what happened in those 45 minutes either. What she did was get a library card, spend 6 months reading everything she'd been too busy to read, volunteer at a community center that ran literacy programs for adults, take a part-time job at the Millfield Public Library because the woman who ran it, a fierce 60-year-old named Dorothy Hines who wore bifocals on a beaded chain and had zero tolerance for nonsense, had posted a handwritten sign in the window that read "Help Wanted. Must love books, must hate noise." And Sarah had stood outside on the sidewalk reading that sign for a full 30 seconds before deciding it was the first thing she'd seen in months that felt like an invitation meant for her. Dorothy hired her in 10 minutes, asked her 3 questions, looked at her for a long moment afterward in a way that made Sarah feel briefly transparent, then said, "You've done something. I don't need to know what. Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5, don't be late." Sarah was never late. She had been working at the library for 8 months when the Tuesday in October arrived. She had built, in those 8 months, something that felt almost like ordinary life, She had a routine. She had a studio apartment with 3 walls of bookshelves and a plant she managed to keep alive. She had a coffee shop she went to every morning, the same corner table, the same order. Black coffee, the largest size, no discussion. She had a running route. She had a Thursday evening phone call with her mother. She had, very carefully, constructed a life that fit around the edges of the thing she was. That didn't press on the parts of her that were still learning how to exist in rooms where no one was trying to kill anybody. She was doing okay. That's the honest version. She was doing okay. Not great. Not effortlessly. Not in the way it might have looked from outside. The way a quiet woman in a cardigan at a library desk might look. Like she had simply always been at peace. She was working at it. Every day, some more than others. And then came Tuesday. The Millfield Public Library closed at 8 on Tuesdays. Sarah usually left by 8:15. After making sure the return books were sorted, the chairs were pushed in. Dorothy's coffee mug was washed and sitting upside down on the drying rack the way Dorothy preferred it. That night she'd stayed slightly later. A patron had come in at 7:50 with a question about a genealogy database that turned into a 40-minute conversation about the patron's grandmother, who had apparently been a remarkable woman. And Sarah had listened to the whole thing because that was who she was, and because the patron had the kind of eyes that needed to be heard. She left at 8:40. The parking lot behind the library was 3/4 empty. 2 overhead lights were working. One at the far end was not. She noticed this the way she noticed everything. Not with alarm, just with registration. The non-working light was a data point. She filed it. She walked toward her car with her bag over her left shoulder and her keys already in her right hand, not because she was afraid, just because that was how she walked. They were by the dumpsters. 3 of them. Mid-20s maybe. She clocked them in her peripheral vision before they moved. There's a thing that happens, with training, with practice. The brain starts to pattern match before the conscious mind gets involved. Something in the way they were standing. The angle of their bodies in relation to the exit. The fact that one of them was already looking at her while pretending not to. Her heart rate went up by approximately 4 beats per minute. That was all. She kept walking toward her car. Kept her pace exactly the same. Unlocked the door with the fob, was reaching for the handle when the first one said something. Loud, meant to carry. The kind of comment that was designed to see if she would flinch. She didn't flinch. She turned around. She looked at them. This is the thing that confused them, that you could see in the half-second recalibration that happened in all 3 faces simultaneously. They had expected something. Fear, maybe. Or anger. Or the particular performance of being a woman alone at night trying to make herself unthreatening. They had expected movement. A quickened pace, a phone coming out, a voice that climbed too high. She just looked at them. Calm, still, standing with her weight distributed in a way that was technically neutral and technically something else entirely. And the difference between those 2 things was not visible unless you knew what you were looking at. The tallest one, the ringleader, the social architect of the situation, the one who had said the thing, started toward her. The second one followed. The third one, the youngest of the 3, hung slightly back. Something in him hesitated. He would think about that hesitation later, in the days and weeks that followed, and understand that whatever that instinct was, it had been correct. The tallest one reached out and grabbed her arm. What happened in the next 11 seconds was not a fight. A fight implies 2 parties with comparable frameworks, comparable intentions, comparable understanding of what is happening. What occurred in that parking lot was 11 seconds of one person applying a very specific set of skills to a situation she had been trained to resolve without escalation when possible, and with decisive and controlled force when escalation was not possible. It was not possible. The tallest one went down first. The second one made a sound Sarah would not be able to describe if you asked her. Not quite pain, not quite surprise, something in between. Something that belonged to the specific moment when a person realizes the world is not the shape they thought it was. Then it was quiet again. The third one, the youngest one, the one who had hesitated, was standing very still with his hands up and his eyes very wide. He had not been touched. He had simply watched. He was already shaking. Sarah looked at him for a moment. "Call 911, she said. Tell them 2 people need assistance." Her voice was completely level. She turned back to her car, got in, rolled down the window. And she sat there, in her car, in that half-dark parking lot, listening to the youngest one making the call with a voice that cracked twice while she waited for the sirens she could hear were already coming. Her hands on the steering wheel were perfectly still. Outside, someone groaned. She looked straight ahead at the one working light above the parking lot exit and waited, the way she always waited, quietly, with everything controlled and nothing showing, for whatever came next. The first police officer to arrive was a woman named Reyes, Officer Carmen Reyes. 26 years on the force, which meant she had arrived at a lot of parking lots at a lot of wrong hours and had developed over those 26 years a very accurate internal calibration for reading a scene before anyone explained it to her. She pulled up, got out, took in the two men on the ground in separate corners of the lot, took in the young third one standing with his hands still raised even though no one had asked him to raise them, and then she saw Sarah's car at the exit with the window down and the engine off, and she walked to it first. She looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at her. "You the one who called it in?" Reyes asked. "He called it in." Sarah indicated the youngest one with a small movement of her head. "I asked him to. Are you hurt?" "No." Then she looked at the two men on the ground, one of whom was sitting up now and holding his wrist with the careful deliberateness of a person trying to determine if a thing is broken, and then she looked back at Sarah. "Step out of the vehicle, please." She did it the way she did everything. Smoothly, without waste. Both feet on the ground at once, the way a person steps out of a car when they are not rushing and not afraid and have nowhere to be in a hurry. She stood with her hands visible and her posture easy, and she waited. Reyes went through the standard questions. Sarah answered them in order, accurately, in complete sentences, with the flat descriptive calm of someone filing a report rather than describing a thing that had happened to them. She used the word approached. She used the word contact. She did not use the word terrifying or frightening or any of the other words a person uses when they are describing something from inside the emotion of it. She described it from outside, from somewhere elevated and clear and factual. Reyes wrote it all down. Then she looked up. "Any military or law enforcement background?" "A beat. Small, almost nothing." "Navy," Sarah said. 4 years. Separated honorably. Reyes wrote that down too. Underlined it, though Sarah couldn't see that from where she was standing. A second patrol car arrived, then a third, an ambulance. The parking lot filled up in the way parking lots do when something has happened. Lights and voices and the particular organized chaos of official response. Sarah stood where she was told to stand. Answered the questions she was asked. Watched the tallest one get loaded onto a stretcher with his right shoulder at an angle it was not designed to achieve, and his face doing something complicated that she didn't interpret and didn't try to. A detective arrived around 10 o'clock. His name was Marsh. He was tired in the deep water way that detectives get tired when they have been doing this long enough. Not exhausted, just permanently slightly below the surface of fully awake. He had a notebook and a coffee in a paper cup, and the professionally sympathetic expression of a man who had perfected it over years of needing it. He talked to the youngest one first for a long time, in a far corner of the lot. Then he came to Sarah. She told him the same things she had told Reyes. In the same order, in the same language. He asked a few different questions. She answered those too. "Miss Cole," he said at one point, tapping his pen against his notebook in a way that suggested he was thinking something, he was deciding whether to say. "The injuries sustained by 2 of the individuals involved are consistent with significant applied force. I want to make sure I have the right picture here. These 3 approached you?" "Yes." "One of them made physical contact first?" "Yes." "He grabbed my left arm above the elbow." "And then?" "And then I removed the threat." Marsh looked at her. She looked back. There was a pause that had some weight to it. "Removed the threat," he repeated. "That's the accurate description," Sarah said. He wrote it down. He did not look entirely sure what to do with it, but he wrote it down. The whole thing took 3 hours. By the time the last patrol car pulled out of the Millfield Library parking lot, it was 11:40 on a Tuesday night in October, and the lot was just a lot again, empty and half dark and smelling of cold air and old asphalt. Sarah drove home, parked, sat in her car for 2 minutes, which was 1 minute and 55 seconds less than she had needed to sit in her car in the airport parking lot 3 years ago. Progress, she thought. Not out loud, just a word in the back of her mind, dry and small, the way her own internal voice always was when she acknowledged something that cost her. She went upstairs, fed her plant, drank a glass of water, sat on her couch and looked at the wall for approximately 8 minutes. Then she went to bed, set her alarm for 6:30, slept. She found out about the video the next morning. She was at the coffee shop, her corner table, her black coffee, when the woman at the next table, a regular, someone Sarah recognized but had never spoken to, held her phone out with the expression people wear when they are sharing something they think you will find astonishing. The video was already at 400,000 views. By the time Sarah put the phone down and picked up her coffee again, it would be at 600. Someone had been in the parking lot, not close, parked at the far end, the end with the working light, sitting in their car doing something on their phone, and they had looked up at exactly the wrong moment and recorded approximately 45 seconds of the 11 that mattered. The clip was blurry at the edges. The audio was the ambient noise of the parking lot and the distant sound of a car somewhere on the street, but the shapes were clear enough. The shapes were unmistakable. The caption read, "Woman defends herself in library parking lot." Nobody was ready for this. She watched it once, set the phone down on the table, picked up her coffee. The woman at the next table was looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for a reaction. Sarah gave her a small nod, which was the honest version of everything she had to say about it. She went to work. Dorothy was already there when she arrived, behind the desk with her bifocals pushed up on her forehead and her morning coffee steaming and the newspaper open to a page that, as Sarah approached the desk, Dorothy folded closed with a decisive snap. "I assume you're fine," Dorothy said. "I'm fine." "Good." Dorothy pushed the folded newspaper to the side of the desk without looking at it again. "Gilmore returns need to be reshelved. Someone put them in romance again." "I'll take care of it," Sarah said. She hung up her bag. She went to find the misplaced Gilmore returns. This was the thing about Dorothy that Sarah had understood within the first week of working for her. The woman's entire operating philosophy could be summarized as follows. People are what they do, and what they do is what matters, and everything else is biographical noise that does not require commentary or ceremony. Dorothy had worked with a man for 11 years before discovering offhandedly that he had played minor league baseball for 2 seasons in his 20s. She had simply said, and returned to what she was doing. She applied the same standard to everything. Sarah's 4 years in the Navy, including things Dorothy almost certainly could have guessed about those 4 years if she applied any of her considerable intelligence to the question, received approximately the same response as the baseball story. It was one of the cleanest relationships Sarah had. The day at the library was ordinary. Patrons came and went. Sarah answered questions, located items, handled the scanner at the checkout desk, ate her lunch in the break room alone with a book. Nobody mentioned the video to her directly, though. She was aware of 2 patrons looking at her for slightly too long in a way that meant they had seen it and were mapping the person they had seen on the screen onto the person standing in front of them and finding the gap between those 2 images interesting. She understood that gap. She lived inside it. Her phone started at noon, not personal calls. She didn't have many of those, and they didn't come in clusters. These were messages from numbers she didn't recognize. A few from journalists, names and outlets she vaguely recognized from her home city's media landscape, asking for comment. 2 from a morning talk show, 1 from a production company whose name she also didn't recognize, which had sent a text that read, "Hi Sarah, we'd love to talk to you about your story. We think it could inspire a lot of people. Would you be open to a brief call?" She did not answer any of them. She put her phone face down on her desk and went back to the Gilmore returns. What she had not been prepared for, in the specific way you can be generally prepared for things and still have a specific version catch you sideways, was the call from her mother. It came at 5:15. She was locking up the periodicals room. "Baby," her mother said, and her voice had the particular quality, thick, slightly elevated, controlled with visible effort, of a woman who had been holding something back for several hours. "I saw it. Marcus sent it to me this morning, and I watched it, and A breath. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay, Mom." "You're sure? You were alone and it was dark and there were 3 of them. I counted there were, I'm sure." A silence. Then her mother said something that landed in Sarah's chest in a way she wasn't expecting. "I never know what to worry about with you. I never know what's actually hard." Sarah stood in the quiet of the locked periodicals room with her hand on the door handle and her mother's voice in her ear, and the familiar weight of that observation, gentle, accurate, and carrying in it a grief she had no clean way to address, settling somewhere below her ribs. "I know," she said. "That's not a criticism, sweetheart. Her mother paused. "You always sound fine. You've always sounded fine. Even when you were deployed and I knew there were things happening that were not fine. You always called and you sounded fine, and I would hang up and sit in the kitchen and not know what to do with myself." Sarah didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't either comfort falsely or cost too much to say accurately. She stayed on the line. Let her mother have the silence, which was its own form of answer. "Will you come home?" her mother said. Not now, not this week. I know you have work, but soon, just for a weekend." "Yes," Sarah said. And she meant it in a way she wasn't sure she'd meant it the last 4 times she'd said it. "Okay," her mother said, and breathed in a way that meant she was adjusting herself back to normal, recomposing, the way she always did after she'd let something show that cost her to show. "Okay, I love you. Love you too." She stood in the locked periodicals room for another minute after the call ended. The shelves were orderly around her, everything in its place. The room smelled like old paper and the particular dry warmth of book dust in a heated room, and she had always found that smell, from childhood, from the school library where she had spent her lunch hours, from the public library 3 blocks from their house, where she had checked out 14 books at a time, and the librarian had eventually stopped counting. She had always found that smell the closest thing she had to what other people called comfort food. This room, this smell, this specific orderliness. She unlocked the door and went back to work. That evening at home, she searched the video herself. Not the short clip, the original, which someone had located and reposted with the full 45 seconds. She watched it twice. Then she looked at the comments section, which she knew immediately was a mistake, and did it anyway, which was a very human thing to do. The comments were, in the way of comments everywhere, simultaneously more and less awful than expected. A significant portion of them were supportive, in the broad, enthusiastic, intimate way, with people tagging each other and writing things like, "She ate," and "main character energy," and "this is literally a movie." A smaller but visible portion were skeptical in various flavors, some accusing the video of being staged, some suggesting the men hadn't really done anything threatening, some doing the particular thing the internet does where it becomes deeply invested in the idea that something inspiring is actually a hoax. A few were hostile in the specific way things get hostile when they involve a woman being capable of something people prefer to believe women are not capable of. She closed the browser, made dinner, ate it standing at a kitchen counter looking out the window at the parking lot of her building, which was lit by 3 working lights. She noted this, all 3 working. She turned away from the window and washed her plate and went to read until she was tired enough to sleep, which took longer that night than it usually did. And when she finally did sleep, she did not dream, or if she did, she did not remember it, which she had come to understand was its own kind of gift. What she did not know yet, lying in her bed in her apartment with its 3 walls of bookshelves and its one surviving plant, was that the video was still accelerating, that it would reach 3 million views by Thursday, that a reporter from a national outlet would park outside the Millfield Public Library on Friday morning and wait for 3 hours, that a woman in Denver who had survived something very different and very similar would watch the clip 17 times and then sit down and write a letter, a real letter, pen and paper, enveloped and stamp, and mail it to the Millfield Public Library addressed to the quiet woman, if this finds her. Sarah didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the room was dark and quiet and orderly, and that her mother's voice was still sitting somewhere in her chest in the specific location where things sat when they were too real to process all at once and needed time. She lay very still. Breathed slowly. Let the darkness be what it was. Outside the city made its nighttime sounds, traffic, a distant siren, a dog 2 floors below her that barked once and then went quiet, ordinary sounds. The sounds of a world that was, for the moment, exactly the shape it was supposed to be. She stayed awake for another 40 minutes, lying still with her eyes open in the dark, running through nothing in particular. Just present, just waiting for the day to finish being a day. Then she slept. The reporter's name was Alicia Strand. She was from a national online outlet that covered human interest stories with the particular energy of a publication that had discovered long ago that the human interest was really just the interest, that people were endlessly more compelling than policy or data, and that a woman in a library parking lot who had sent 2 men to the hospital with her bare hands was, objectively, a story that would not need to be told to find its audience. She was good at her job. That was the first thing Sarah registered when she came out the library's side door on Friday morning and found Alicia Strand standing on the pavement with a press badge and a recorder and the particular posture of a person who has been waiting for a while and has decided not to let the waiting make them aggressive. "Ms. Cole," she said. Not a shout, not an ambush. Just a name said in a normal voice by someone who had positioned themselves in the clear line of sight between Sarah and the parking lot, which meant they could be seen coming. This, Sarah understood, was a deliberate choice. A small professional kindness. 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 "I don't have a comment," Sarah said. "I understand." Alicia Strand said this without the deflating performance of someone who had expected anything different. "I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm not here to print something about you without your participation. I'd rather you participate." A pause. "My card if you change your mind." She held out a business card. It was a real card, stiff, cream-colored, embossed slightly. Not a phone number typed into a text. An actual card. The kind that required a decision to print and carry, and Sarah found this detail oddly significant in a way she couldn't immediately explain. She took the card. She went inside. She put it on her desk next to her stapler and didn't look at it again until 3 o'clock, when she looked at it for about 10 seconds and then put it in the center drawer and closed the drawer. Dorothy, who noticed everything that happened within the library's walls with a precision that suggested she had sensors installed in the architecture, said nothing about the card. She also said nothing about the fact that 2 other people had approached Sarah at the front desk that morning. Not reporters, just patrons. People who had seen the video and wanted to say something, and who said it in the specific key of people who are not sure if what they're doing is welcome, and are doing it anyway because they feel compelled. One woman in her 50s had clasped Sarah's hand with both of hers and said simply, "Good for you," in a voice that had something else buried in it, something that didn't have anything to do with a parking lot. A teenage boy had said, "You're like actually famous," with a kind of delighted incredulity that Sarah found, despite herself, briefly funny. She processed returns. She filed the periodicals. She explained the microfiche reader to a man who was 93 years old and completely lucid and had been using the library since it was in a different building on a different street, and he told her about that building, which had apparently had better acoustics and worse coffee, and she listened to all of it, and when he left she stood at the desk for a moment, feeling something she couldn't quite name, some small warmth that lived inside ordinary things when you paid them the attention they deserved. The harder thing arrived at 4:15. In the form of a phone call she actually answered because the name on the screen was one she had stored, and the seeing of it did something complicated to her chest before she even picked up. It was James Okafor. She had served with him for 8 months in the second deployment. He was the person she trusted most entirely in the world, which was a small category and not one she had ever been careless with. He called her Ace, which was a story she also did not tell people, and hearing it now in his voice, low, amused, carrying under the amusement the thread of something genuine, made her sit down on the break room chair with more weight than she intended. "So," he said. "So," she said, 3 million views. I haven't been looking. That's a lie, and we both know it. A beat. You good?" This question, from James, meant something more specific than the same question from anyone else. It was a calibrated question. It was asking which kind of good. The functional kind, the performing kind, or the actual kind. Functional, she said. Yeah. A pause that meant he was accepting that and registering that it was not the same as fine. You handling it? Managing? The media things? Ignoring them mostly? Probably right. He was quiet for a moment, and she knew this pause, knew it from hundreds of hours of sitting in proximity to him in conditions that required silence, knew the particular texture of it, the way he breathed when he was about to say something he had been holding back. Ace. They're going to want to make this into something. Clip goes this wide, someone puts a thing on it. A narrative. They're going to want to tell a story about you that isn't actually about you. I know. What they'll want is the soldier thing. The tough woman thing. The before and after. The transformation narrative. He said these words with an exact and specific disdain. The kind that comes from having watched people you care about get flattened into stories. They'll want the 4 years to be the whole explanation, and it's not. She said nothing. She was looking at the break room wall, which was painted a color that had no particular name. Not beige, not grey, something between the two that had clearly been chosen by a committee with no strong feelings. You were always this, James said. The Navy just gave it a context. She sat with that for a moment. It sat differently than she expected. Not like a comfort exactly. More like a recognition, the way something feels when it's been true for a long time and you're only now hearing someone else say it. I know that too, she said quietly. Good. And she could hear the smile in his voice. The one that was more in the eyes than the mouth. The one she had seen deployed in actual dark places when it had cost him something to produce it, and he had produced it anyway because that was what he did. Go do your library thing. Call your mother more than you think you need to. She called me. She always calls. You call back. She almost said something that would have been the honest version of what that landed like. The accuracy of it. The fact that he had in 2 sentences identified a thing she had been sitting next to without fully seeing it for 3 years. She almost said it. Okay, she said instead. Okay, he said, and hung up. She sat in the break room for 7 more minutes. Then she went back to the floor. The weekend passed. She went running on Saturday morning. 7 miles along the river path, temperature in the low 40s, the sky the color of old pewter, and the trees along the path holding their last leaves with diminishing conviction. She ran the way she always ran, which was steadily and without music, because she had never learned to run with music. The headphones felt like a reduction in information, a narrowing of the field, and she had been too long in the practice of wanting the full field. She ran and she looked at the river and she thought about almost nothing, which is different from thinking about nothing, and when she got back to her apartment she was cold and clean and slightly more herself than she had been at the start. She cooked. She read. She called her mother Sunday evening, initiated it, which was a thing she noted in herself and did not make a ceremony of. Her mother picked up on the second ring with the particular speed of someone who had been holding their phone nearby. They talked for an hour and 15 minutes. They talked about Marcus, who had just gotten a promotion at work and was characteristically low-key about it in a way that drove their mother cheerfully insane. They talked about the garden, which her mother was putting to bed for winter, and about a neighbor dispute involving a fence that had apparently reached small drama proportions in the cul-de-sac. Her mother did not mention the video. Sarah did not mention it either. At some point, her mother told a story about the hardware store where Gerald used to work. It was closing, the building sold, being turned into something else. And Sarah said, "Oh," and they both stayed on the line for a moment, holding that small fact between them. He would have had thoughts about that, Sarah said. Lord, would he have, her mother said and laughed. And the laugh was the real kind, the full kind, the kind that lives in a place past grief and comes out the other side of it changed but intact. Sarah laughed too. It surprised her, the way her own laugh surprised her sometimes, genuine, arriving before she'd decided to let it, belonging to some part of her that preceded all the careful architecture. Monday came. Then Tuesday, 1 week exactly since the parking lot. Detective Marsh called her at 9 in the morning to inform her that charges had been filed and that she might be contacted regarding the proceedings, though given the evidence and the testimony of the third man, the young one, the one who had hesitated and called 911 and subsequently provided what Marsh described in his careful detective's language as a complete and corroborating account, it was unlikely she would need to testify. She thanked him. He said she had done nothing wrong by any legal or any other standard she said she knew. He seemed slightly unsatisfied by this but had no follow-up question that would have improved things, so he wrapped up the call in 2 sentences and hung up. She was refiling a card of returns when the letter arrived. Dorothy brought it to her. It had been hand-delivered to the front desk by a patron who said the mailman had left it on the steps outside, which was true. The address was correct but incomplete, reading only, Millfield Public Library, to the quiet woman in the parking lot, if this finds her. Dorothy had opened it. This was within her rights as the library director, and she exercised it without apology, which was completely Dorothy, and she handed the open envelope to Sarah, along with the single sheet of folded paper inside it. Sarah read it at the returns cart. The letter was from a woman in Denver. It was 2 pages, handwritten, in a clear, careful script that suggested the writer had taken her time. She did not give her full name, just an initial, C. She explained that she had watched the video 11 times before she wrote the letter, though by the time it reached Sarah, she had watched it 17. She wrote about her own experience, briefly and without detail, in the specific way of someone who has made peace with an event enough to reference it but not enough to revisit it fully. She wrote, "I recognized the look on your face, the way you just waited and then handled it. I recognized it because I have spent years wishing I had a face like that. I didn't then. I'm working on it. Watching you helps." She wrote, "I don't need you to write back. I just needed you to know it meant something." Sarah stood at the returns cart for approximately 45 seconds after she finished reading it. She folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then she put the envelope in the pocket of her cardigan. She went back to the returns, refiled the cart, thought briefly about C from Denver, about what she was working on, about the particular kind of work it was, the slow, non-dramatic, daily kind, the kind that doesn't look like much from outside and costs more than you expect from inside, the kind of work that doesn't make the clip. She filed the last return. Pushed the cart to the side of the aisle. Dorothy was at the front desk when she came back, doing something with the check-in system, not looking up. Sarah stopped at the desk and stood there for a moment. "Dorothy," she said. Dorothy looked up over her bifocals. "Thank you," Sarah said, "for this place, the job." Dorothy held her eyes for a second in that way she had, penetrating and brief and absolutely without sentimentality. Then she pushed her bifocals back up and returned to the check-in system. "Don't thank me," Dorothy said. "You do the work, I just unlocked the door." Sarah nodded, went back to her desk, sat down, opened the center drawer and looked at the reporter's card for a moment. Alicia Strand, the cream-embossed card with the clean font. She took it out, set it on the desk, looked at it, thought about what James had said. They'll want to tell a story about you that isn't actually about you. And then the other thing, you were always this. Thought about C, from Denver, about her mother's laugh. About the 45 minutes in the airport parking lot 3 years ago. About Gerald Cole's 4-second hug. She thought about quiet. About what it was and what people assumed it was, and the gap between those two things that she had spent her whole life inhabiting. She picked up her phone, looked at the card, dialed the number. It rang twice. Alicia Strand, said the voice on the other end. Professional, alert, careful. Sarah looked at the far wall of the library, at the shelves, at the orderly spines of things organized and cared for and made accessible and preserved. This is Sarah Cole, she said. I want to talk, but on my terms. And you use my words, not a frame you put on them. A pause, not a long one. The pause of someone recalibrating, not with disappointment but with respect, the specific recalibration of a professional encountering a subject who already knows exactly where the trapdoors are. Your words, Alicia Strand said. My word on it. Sarah looked at the shelves, thought about C. Letter in her pocket folded small, weighty for its size. Okay, she said. Outside, through the library's high windows, the sky had gone the deep grey blue of a late October afternoon, tipping toward evening. The kind of sky that looked like weather coming. The kind that made the lights inside seem warmer by contrast, made the shelves and the quiet and the orderly rows of things feel more like shelter than she usually let herself notice. She sat in that shelter, on her terms, ready, for the first time in a long time, to let something show. They touched the quiet girl, not realizing she's Navy SEAL trained.